If you've worried about being too emotional with your clients and maybe even how to deal with compassion fatigue, well, you're going to want to stay tuned for today's episode with Dr. Jill Levitt as she talks about how there's times where she has tears streaming down her face with patients, and it's actually a good thing. Welcome to Talking Team CBT, where you'll hear stories from therapists and clinicians around the world on their journey and experience with Team CBT.
Okay, so welcome everyone to another episode of Talking Team with Angela Poach and Daniel Herman. Today we're super excited to welcome Dr. Jill Levitt, who is the Director of Training at the Feeling Good Institute at Mountain View, and she's a licensed clinical psychologist. There's so much to say about her, but I'll say mostly that she's not only a certified level 5 master therapist and trainer in Team CBT therapy, and teaches both in-person and online workshops at the Feeling Good Institute on CBT methods, reducing resistance in psychotherapy, and improving the effectiveness of psychotherapy. And it's just a real privilege for us to have you on, because you trained both of us as well. So welcome, Jill.
Thank you. It's exciting to be here. Thank you guys for having me.
Super. I'm glad to have
Absolutely
you.
our pleasure. I'm sure, Angela, you also had opportunity to be in plenty of, not just, of course, the Sunday workshops that we get to be part of, but the plenty of other workshops that you trained us in and continue to train people in. So looking forward to hearing more about that today. But maybe you could just start off by telling us just a little bit, about what brought you, I guess, to to first experience Team CBT.
Sure. Excuse me, I'm still getting over a cold. Yeah, well, actually, I do know exactly kind of where and when I came to Team CBT, and that was about 15 years ago. I moved to California from New York, and prior to moving, I definitely considered myself a CBT therapist. I went to Boston University for my PhD in clinical psychology, and I was trained by David Barlow and Stefan Hoffman and a bunch of kind of amazing CBT mentors. And I got a bunch of CBT training from Edna Foa in New York. So I had a lot of CBT training. I came to New York and I had closed my private practice. I came to California. I closed my private practice in New York City and moved here to start totally fresh because we wanted to move to California to be closer to my brother's family. And so I was 7 months pregnant with my second son. I had to sit for the California licensing exam and like literally start over. And as I was starting up a tiny private practice in Los Altos, California, I was thinking, I've been not working, not seeing patients for maybe 3 or 4 months after having my son and moving. And I wanted to contact someone to do a little bit of supervision or case consultation with me. And I thought, well, who better to reach out to than the, CBT guru, David Burns. I know he lives somewhere out here. So I just literally sent him an email and said, hey, this is who I am. And I wonder if you'd be willing to consult on some cases with me. And he kindly wrote me back right away and said, oh, well, I don't do kind of like one-on-one consultation anymore, but I run this free group out of my living room in Los Altos, which is the town I was living in. And you'd be welcome to join like on Tuesday. So I thought this was like incredible. I was, starting a private practice out here and like super excited to consult with other CBT therapists. So I started going to the Tuesday group, like I said, 15 years ago or so, when it was in David's living room. And then we moved to Stanford, and kind of like I've been attending for the last 15 years. And David sort of promoted me from student to small group leader, and then eventually to co-leader. But it, totally had a huge impact on my life in general, definitely on the way that I practice and interact with my patients, but then it, created a whole community for me. And I also feel a little bit like I think we all do, which is that we not only practice these skills with our patients, but it's like we live these skills day in and day out in our lives. So I feel like I've learned so much, just like how to be a better person through my interactions with David and learning the Team CBT model.
A little bit. I don't think I'd heard the gist of that story, of course, over the years, but I don't know if I got the full sense of it from starting in the living room too. Of course, if anyone
Yeah.
missed that, Jill's not only attending for the past 15 years, but co-leads the group with David, and it's an incredible a group. But maybe you could tell us a little bit more. You said like how, of course, it not just affects us professionally, but personally. Like, do you have any specific examples or stories of how team has really affected your own personal life?
Sure. Yeah, well, first I would say just this is a slightly different question, but I'll come to this too. But that I thought was important was for me, even just when I learned sort of like the team CBT model versus all the CBT training that I had had before, I loved the idea of the emphasis on empathy, right? So I felt like I was always this CBT therapist who had tons of tools in my toolbox, and was kind of like rushed to get to work. And I did consider myself an empathic person, but I felt like learning the 5 secrets of effective communication and having this total, framework for being empathic and following kind of the guidelines was super helpful to me. And I just felt like so much closer to my patients, and I felt kind of more able to even like push patients with tough methods, having this kind of, I think, much deeper and much closer connection with my patients. So I felt like that was one thing. And then also David's whole emphasis and the team CBT emphasis on resistance, on kind of, agreeing with your patient and all the good reasons not to change, and like really seeing the truth in their suffering and kind of the beauty in their suffering, I felt also added a total layer to my like ability to help the more stuck patients, the more stubborn patients, the more resistant patients. Felt always like the ones that were motivated, I could, help tremendously, but the ones that were more on the fence, obviously I struggled a lot with. And so, so anyway, that was the piece about just like what I felt like how team really improved my clinical skills.
Well, I love hearing that because, David now considers you the world's greatest empathic person. We've heard that on the podcast plenty of times. So it's good to hear the kind of the progression and the journey of how one improves skills.
That's funny. It's very funny because David always, he used to actually sort of tease me about being like almost too nice. And I always said I feel very misunderstood because I don't actually, I think that I'm warm, but I actually think that I'm very direct with people and very to the point, and not like a doormat. And so I do feel like the team skills have given me this roadmap for balancing kind of empathy with accountability, and kind of always holding those two things in balance with my patients, but really like in my personal life too, right? Empathy, connection, warmth, but also kind of holding people accountable and not being a doormat.
Yeah.
So I totally, I credit David, for all of that.
I mean, I've heard David say that in Tuesday Group too. It's pretty funny, but I think part of it is because, I've watched when things have been really challenging in Tuesday Group, and as challenging as they are, you always have this amazing way of pulling the 5 secrets out when I think it would be really difficult for people who haven't had as much skill as you. So I think it's well deserved. I think you deserve that title.
Thank you.
You mentioned this, you always consider yourself a CBT trainer, or excuse me, therapist, and you did some work with EdnaFOA and anxiety work. Tell us a little bit about that and how you integrate that into team.
Yeah, well, I went to grad school at Boston University, and so my mentor there was David Barlow, and also Stefan Hoffman, and both of them, like from day one of my grad school training, I learned how to identify distortions, how to challenge negative thoughts, and then also exposure. So my very first patient when I was 22 years old and just beginning grad school, like they had us starting off right off the bat, my very first patient was this woman who was afraid of driving. And we were in like Kenmore Square in Boston, which if anyone knows Boston, it's like a busy hub. It's right by where the Red Sox play at Fenway Park. And I had to literally not only treat her in person, but I had to go driving with her all over Boston through the bridges and the tunnel. It was insane. But that was my first exposure to
You're getting
therapy.
some exposure too.
Yeah, right, totally. Yes. And I'm someone who gets motion sick too, so I was like praying that I wouldn't like throw up on my patient in the car. Anyway, but I say that to say that yeah, my training kind of from the outset was pretty hardcore CBT, as they say. And so I think I feel very grateful that I learned like a lot of tools and techniques early on, and kind of learned to look for negative thoughts and anxious thoughts, and for avoidance behaviors and all of that. But again, what I felt was missing kind of in that CBT model was the emphasis on empathy, on meeting the patient where they're at, on sort of leading with empathy, and also the emphasis on resistance and motivation. So I feel like the CBT, of course, is totally compatible with team CBT, because I think of it as just team CBT is like taking all the best of CBT and then sort of adding these two other. This is the way I think of it, like adding these two other components. And the T in team stands for testing, and that for me actually was always a part of my CBT training. So from day one, I also was trained to use measures. We didn't do them before and after every session. But we did measures like every 4 sessions. And that I was trained that like any good therapist always uses measurements to track progress. However, what David also brought to that, which I think is a vast improvement, is this like using kind of therapeutic alliance measures after every session. And that was different for me. We also did that occasionally, but this idea of feeling like after every session, I don't really know how I did or how it went until I get to see my feedback. And then I have a much better understanding, either positive or negative, but of kind of how my patient is perceiving treatment.
Yeah, right. Because what Jill is referring to is that not only, do we do testing of symptoms before and after every session, so we actually know how our patients are doing instead of guessing, but we actually also get feedback on how we're doing and where we're failing. And I agree with you. That's been transformative for I think all of us to kind of see our mistakes and see our fail and be able to improve and rectify that.
Yeah.
I think when we asked David, if you ask people like of the 4 parts of the team, that testing in some ways is the most critical part of, in addition to the empathy part that you mentioned, Jill, and of course the melting away of the resistance.
Yeah.
So let me ask you a little bit of a different question, I guess, because we know not only do you do so much training, but of course you also have a successful practice. So maybe you could tell us just a little bit more about how. I mean, you've told us already a little bit, but maybe there's a I don't know specific example or other thing you wanted to mention of just how adding in these elements. Again, you always were doing cognitive behavioral therapy, but how either testing or this approach to empathy or the resistance has impacted your clients.
Sure. Yeah, I could probably tell you one story about each one. I remember one, I did tell one of these stories in a workshop recently for the first time, but there was a woman that I was working with. This is an empathy story, but there was a woman that I was working with many years ago, who I was starting to work with on her panic disorder, and I felt like we had a good relationship. And she was sharing with me some anxious thoughts that she had that to me seemed like sort of typical anxious thoughts for panic disorder, like that she would lose control or go crazy. And this was on a daily mood log. We were looking at her negative thoughts. And so I was kind of moving us through the process. And she did mention something about part of the reason is because my sister struggles with major mental illness and a schizophrenia. And she got kind of emotional when she was saying it. And so I thought I sort of paused and empathized a bit, and then I kind of like moved on. I was like really excited to help her with these thoughts, thinking, oh, I totally get like where we're going, and this is so classic. And so then apparently I really missed the boat. I didn't pick up on just how profoundly upset she was about her sister's mental illness and what an impact this had on her. And also didn't necessarily realize that I was maybe one of the first people she was opening up to.
Yeah.
And so I didn't know any of this, but when I got the feedback from her, the testing that we're talking about, she basically said to me that, that she, sort of like, while I appreciate the methods that we're using, I feel like you didn't listen to me at all today. You totally missed this huge thing. And like, I don't even know if I plan to come back. Like she was so upset about it. And she did come back. And then we had this like really, I think, beautiful session where, and I was actually moved to tears when I was saying to her that I felt so sad that I had missed this because I
Mm,
truly felt just how important this was to her. And so I just, shared with her that I was so grateful that she came back and that I sort of this is what was going through my head at the time, and I was like wanting so badly to help you, but in doing in doing so I just totally missed this opportunity to connect with you, and I want to hear more about it. And she was really moved to tears too, and like very much appreciated it. Totally got us back on track in therapy. And I know for sure I never would have had the well, I wouldn't have had the measures, so I wouldn't have known, right, to talk to her about it in the past. So that's the testing piece. And I also know I wouldn't have been, I think I would have like justified my behavior. I wouldn't have been quite so disarming and agreeing and just like really kind of open and vulnerable
mhm.
if I hadn't have had, the training and empathy and the five secrets.
Yeah, well, that's what I was thinking as you said that. And it sounds like a masterful use of a number of the five secrets of disarming, some feeling empathy, I feel statements, and
Right.
yeah, I agree with that. That's what's led to I think when we do get that kind of feedback, they were able to respond in a non-defensive way, and
Yeah,
then I think David often says that sometimes our greatest failures become then our greatest successes. It kind of opens the door to even better work.
totally. Yeah.
Yeah. The,
Yeah, but yeah,
go
Angela, go
ahead,
ahead.
Daniel. Oh, I was just thinking about when you said move to tears. I almost felt a little teary myself because I think that that is part of empathy is actually being present with our patients and
Yeah.
our clients. And I think that's a little bit maybe either dismissed or even looked down upon a little bit in the psychology community in some ways. So, we hear about boundaries and things like that. And I hear that when I'm training. A lot of people are like, well, I'm not sure how to do an I feel statement without, breaking the wall. Like there's this wall. And I think most therapists are pretty good at being professional, but
Hmm.
being open, it becomes a little more of a challenge. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
sorry.
I know people do bring that up. You guys have probably heard me say this in training groups too, but like, I mean, I kind of love tears. Like I feel
Yeah,
zero shame around my own tears. And I'm not like sobbing or like needing my patient to console me, but frequently I have tears running down my face actually in sessions. I mean, that was an example of when I truly felt sad that I had like hurt her. But
Mm,
a lot of times, actually, people will tell me stories. Everybody has their own triggers. For me, actually, what moves me to tears frequently is like beautiful things like when they tell me a story about a friend that showed up for them
mm,
or like a sibling that like they had gotten distant from who they like had this successful reunion with, and like that's the kind of thing that has me tearing up. But I always say to therapists when they worry about crying with their patients that it will hurt their patients or something, I say, well, we're getting feedback, right? You're getting, so
yeah,
you will know, like you will know. And I've never had anyone write on an evaluation of therapy session form that like my therapist was a mess or I was upset. And frequently I've had people say like I felt so cared about, I felt so loved, I felt so seen. So yeah, I think to me it's usually just comes from a true, deep, caring for another person, which I think most people are see as a positive.
yeah. I've
yeah.
definitely gotten really good feedback when I shared with clients, and for sure.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, we could probably talk to you all day here, but I definitely want to get to at least a little bit about training before maybe Angela asks another question, because you're the director of training at FGI and you've trained probably thousands of therapists. Curious if you could tell us maybe just a little bit, Jill, like what, as you do this training, what maybe two things. Number one, what you find new therapists or even therapists who are just new to team CBT kind of really finding difficult to master in team CBT, and at the same time, what aspect also kind of really changes, like is that light bulb moment for them as they learn this new approach.
Yeah, I think the thing that comes to my mind is what seems so hard to master, which is hard for me too, is what we call sitting with open hands. So I think it's this idea that with Team CBT, we're not trying to push our patients to change. We're really trying to side with the voice of the patient's resistance so that they can argue for change, right? So if a patient has good reasons to hang on to their OCD, they want to protect their children, they want to do no harm, and we can sort of like put a voice to that, to express that, and wonder out loud, why would you want to change? Kind of given all the good reasons to keep doing what you're doing, it puts them in a position of arguing for change, right? Now, when that goes well and patients argue for change, of course, we feel great, but there are patients who actually decide that they don't want to change. And as a therapist, I find that really difficult because obviously we went into this business because we want to help people change, and we can see, how things would be better, and we know we have the tools. And so I think the same thing that my students find difficult is what I find difficult as well, which is sitting with open hands, meaning that if a patient decides that they don't want to change, and they can't really convince you of why it's a good idea, and there's to some extent just better, greater advantages to keeping the status quo, then we kind of say, I totally understand that. That makes a ton of sense to me, and you don't need to change. And either maybe there's something else that you wanted my help with, or even maybe now is not the right time for you to be pursuing therapy. Even though you're definitely experiencing some pain, it sounds like it's working for you more than it's hurting you. And that, I think, is just, it's really hard. And I do think it's an important skill, because otherwise what we end up doing is dragging our patients unwillingly through therapy, basically forcing them to do the work that we think they should do, which invariably leads to a really adversarial and unpleasant relationship. And I would argue it probably leads to therapist burnout too, right? Because who wants to be working session after session against your patients? So it's super liberating, but it's also, I think, really hard to wrap your head around.
Yeah, that it is very liberating, but it does take time to let go of the helping mechanism that's drove us in this business in the first place, right? And finding that happy balance. And that, I think one thing that one of the takeaways that I had experienced, and I honestly don't remember which trainer it was, but it was the idea that I'm actually helping more when I sit with open hands, because the client is in the role of being in control of their life, and that's much more helpful than anything that I could do if I'm dragging them kicking and screaming. But so true.
It reminds me, I just wanted to add, it reminds me, so I'm always thinking, for whatever reason, probably because they're my two great passions, but I'm always thinking about the intersection of Team CBT and parenting, because I have two teenage boys, and I think as much about parenting as I think about therapy. And these lessons that we learned in Team CBT, exactly what we're just talking about, I mean, that's so relevant to parenting, particularly so teenagers. True. Maybe little ones, you might need to do a lot more for them with or without their consent, but like with teenagers, it's like I can't push them to do what they don't want to do. I'm not trying to do that, and like my relationship with them is my number one priority, and so I'm constantly having to like bite my tongue and sit with open hands, right, for the sake of, as you say, Angela, for the sake of them running their own lives and making their own choices, and also for the sake of our relationship. But anyway, I think it's cool. It's like a 2-for-1. Learning how to be a good therapist is to some extent relevant to learning how to be a good parent.
I'm so glad you brought that up. There's such an integrated part. I totally used what I was learning in team, when my son was going through his teenage years, and it made a huge difference. I mean, the kids would call up and say, can we just have the party at your place? And so they'd randomly show up at, even though they had planned to go someone else's place, but they knew that they could just come here, and I'd put on pizza and they could play games. So having that experience meant that there was a trust. When you allow for that space, they feel like they can trust you, and then they're willing to share things that maybe they wouldn't otherwise be willing to share. So I just love that you tied that together. Well, man, I wish we had more time, but we're trying to keep these a little on the shorter side. People have time to listen to them during lunch hours and work. Everybody's busy with work. Our last question we ask everyone is, if every therapist in the world were listening, what's one thing about team that you would like them to know?
Oh, that's a hard question because we've covered so much already. Well, let's see. I think probably what I would say, which would be to sort of summarize what I mentioned earlier, is that this is a like format, for doing effective therapy or framework for doing effective therapy that will impact not only your professional life and change the lives of your patients, but also you couldn't help but have it, dramatically improve your personal life and your relationships with people well beyond, your relationships with your patients.
Beautifully said. Well, thank you so much for being here today, Jill. And just to remind everyone, we mentioned FGI, that's the Feeling Good Institute. And you're welcome to go there. We always have a link in our end credits, but we'll put some in the description as well if you want to get more training. Jill has an amazing core skills course, which is you can do at your own leisure. It's a self-paced course, but then you also have live trainings that happen throughout the year. So be sure to look at those. She's definitely gave team a solid framework for myself, and I'm sure Daniel as well. He's nodding.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much for being here, Jill.
Thank you both. It was really fun.
Yep, thanks for joining.